How are you doing, Eric? By the way, I should say hi.
Yeah. But, I haven't. Nothing's changed since our backstage talk. Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. Doing pretty
Well,
good.
good to see you. Glad you're here.
Got a little bit of a cold, so fair warning that my voice will be in and out. But I'm determined. Between throat lozenges and hot tea, we'll keep it going for the next hour and a half. No problem.
Okay, sounds good. All right. I'm just looking. I get distracted by the chat. New Zealand sounds good. Great. We have somebody from overseas, so that's fantastic. Looks like we actually have several. I'm missing them. So Stefan from Sweden and Claire from Yorkshire. Forgive me if I miss at first. So this is great. We're at the top of the hour, so I guess we can go ahead and get started. Well, I say that it looks like we still have several being dumped in. So I'm gonna buy just one more minute, and maybe in the chat, tell us what is a topic that you would really like to hear in the future. And if you think about that, maybe something doesn't come to mind right now. Halfway through, if that pops into your mind and you think of something, go ahead and put it in there, put it in the chat, and we'll pick up later, and maybe we can do something on that, whether with Eric or maybe somebody else that if it's outside his wheelhouse, which I don't know if there's a lot that's outside your wheelhouse, Eric, or not.
Oh man, no, there's definitely walls in my wheelhouse. That's
Okay.
I definitely have lines.
Well, no, I
But
respect you for saying that. Not every.
people that exist outside those lines, so it's all
Yeah.
okay.
Okay, we're at 9:01. It looks like we've got a quorum. So hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, QMSR, the final rule, meeting FDA's new requirements. My name is Etienne Nichols. I'm a medical device guru here at Greenlight Guru. I'll be the moderator for today's event. Today's event is going to run for about 90 minutes in total, depending on how long Eric's voice holds out. So we'll try to be kind to him, but we definitely want to hear from you. So most of you, looks like you've already found the chat. So thank you for throwing that in there. On the right side of the screen at the very top tab, you'll see an additional tab, which is the Q&A tab. So the chat tab is where you can engage with us, talk to other attendees. But if you have a question you definitely want us to ask Eric, put it in the Q&A section so that we can make sure that we get that asked either today or forwarded on to Eric so that he can potentially answer it at a different time.
Yep.
One question we always get is, will you be sharing the full recording and the slides? Yes, that will be shared afterwards. So keep an eye out for that. That'll be coming in an email later, either this week or next week. I'd also like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. Improving the quality of life for our customers and their patients is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. It's likely a similar mission to many of you joining us today. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free webinars, partnering with world-class medical device experts like today's presenter, or through our award-winning cloud-based solution. At Greenlight Guru, our focus is on moving MedTech forward. Our solutions are designed to help streamline your processes so that you can navigate the regulatory hurdles and succeed in the market. Our MedTech suite provides project management, product development, and clinical data management solutions, along with high-quality training and education designed exclusively for medical devices. So if you're interested to learn why 1,100 of the world's leading MedTech companies trust Greenlight Guru, head over to www.greenlight.guru after the presentation, and you can get a personalized demo of the software. All right, let me give you a proper introduction for your presenter today. Eric Henry is the Senior Quality Systems and Compliance Advisor in the FDA and Life Sciences practice of the firm King & Spalding. He's a 35-year industry veteran, and since 2018 has provided advisory and consulting services focused on regulatory compliance, enforcement, and policy matters for industry regulated by the FDA. Eric's guidance focuses on FDA requirements to professionals in medical device manufacturing, including quality systems requirements, inspection readiness, and post-market obligations. He also advises corporate management and boards on the responsibilities and expectations of the FDA. And with that, I'll let you take it away, Eric.
All right, thanks, Etienne. Appreciate it very much. And I will. Oh, good. I'm sharing. Excellent. So first of all, thanks everyone for coming and attending this session. Very much appreciate the time that you spend, and I know it's valuable time to step away from other things that you're doing. Hopefully, this will be valuable to you as we look at what the FDA has in store for us over the course of the next couple of years. As Etienne said, this is me. Most of this he read already, but if you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me directly, and I'd be happy to connect with you and discuss with you how I can help you out in anything that you have going on. Let's get started though, right into our content material, and I'll take it. I'll try to make sure that if I don't get done earlier, that I leave at least 10 or 15 minutes, maybe closer to 15, depending on the number of questions we have, to talk with, to answer any questions that you might have and provide that Q&A period. As Etienne said, if you do have questions that we don't get to today, they are capturing those, and as with other presentations I've done with Greenlight Guru, they'll send me that spreadsheet after the webinar, and I'll try to respond to all of those if I can within a few days after this session. So if you don't get it answered today, hopefully you will in the next few days. So what's going on? We currently have this thing called a quality system regulation. It's in Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations under Part 820. It was effective in its current form as the quality system regulation starting in June of 1997. Actually, it was written in 96 and released as a final rule, but then they had a one-year transition period to make an effective date in 1997. And it replaced what were called good manufacturing practices for medical devices that were established in 1978. And 20 years later, the GMPs turned into the QSR. At the time the QSR was released, it was harmonized in most respects to ISO 13485 1996, the 1996 revision of that standard, and makes mention of that standard multiple times in the preamble to the final rule. The current QSR, as those of you that have been following it for however long you've been in the industry are probably aware, is people that manufacture either foreign or domestic to the United States finished medical devices. That does not currently include component manufacturers, although those component manufacturers often get evaluated by virtue of purchasing controls under 21 CFR 820.50. Also, if you look across the different quality system elements, the QSR says if you're involved in design, manufacturing, packaging, labeling, storage, installation, or servicing of finished medical device manufacturers, then those are also within the scope. And so you may get inspected or subject to the quality system regulations as they apply to the specific task you're doing if you're not doing all of those for an FMD. And obviously, the U.S. can't set regulatory policy for areas of the world outside of its borders, but within the U.S., the contiguous 48 states and the 2 states of Alaska and Hawaii, as well as the District of Columbia, the U.S. territories, and Puerto Rico are all within scope of the quality system regulation. There's one big requirement here, and that is that you have a quality system and that it's appropriate, and that it meets the requirements of this part, meaning 21 CFR Part 820. We're going to hit this last bullet again later on in the presentation. And again, please do pardon my voice if hopefully it's not too soft for people to hear. But any product, and this comes not only from the regulation, but also from the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which the regulation elaborates and is spawned off of, says that if you don't follow the quality system regulation, then the FDA deems your product adulterated. And it seems like a pretty strong term, and it's not a term we normally associate with not following regulatory requirements. Adulterated to many of us kind of smacks of, there's a fly in my soup or something, and that makes my soup adulterated. There's some contaminant in it. But the way that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act reads, the way the quality system regulation reads, and in fact, if you look at boilerplate language the FDA sends out with all of its warning letters, they say there that if you are not following the requirements of the quality system regulation, then your product is deemed adulterated. So that's something to keep in mind. That will not change, just to shoot to the end, that will not change under the new QMSR, Quality Management System Regulation. A couple of quick slides for those of you that just need a reminder on sort of the table of contents of Part 820. The first is that that we have a series of sections, and some of these are QSIT elements, meaning they're the quality system inspection technique that the FDA uses to conduct inspections of medical device firms. Consider these core elements that they inspect, and of course they get to the other elements through those, but the direct focus of the inspection are going to be these elements. So wherever you see an asterisk, those are elements that are part of the quality system inspection technique. So the current Part 820 has management controls, which covers the quality policy, how the two roles of manager with executive responsibility and management representative. Keep those in mind. That shifts a little under the new regulation. We deal with management review, quality audits, training, where people have to be qualified by training, education, and experience to perform their roles as they are in compliance to roles as they perform all the activities within this Part 820. And that's under management controls, part of the QSIT. It's one of the QSIT elements. Another QSIT element are design controls. We have all the primary elements of design controls here. One thing I'll point out here, because it's going to become relevant later, is that when we think of risk management, that does not have a section in the current QSR, as many of you may already know. But what we have instead is within the design validation section of design controls, there is a statement saying that you should also do risk analysis where it's appropriate. And so that is kind of buried inside the design controls, design validation regulation, but does not have its own area, our own section, our own language. We have the document control, approvals and changes, purchasing controls to both qualify suppliers and maintain them as suppliers as well. And then going on the last slide on just kind of where we are currently, we have a production and process controls, which is also a QSIT element, which has a wide variety of things in it around the manufacturing process, but also includes, again, a kind of an awkward fit, the software validation for software that is not in the medical device, but supports manufacturing, production, or any other part of the quality system. The requirement to validate that software actually sits within the production and process controls part of the regulation. Well, we have CAPA, corrective action and preventive action, or actually that's a little bit of a misnomer because in 21 CFR 820.100, it's actually called corrective and preventive action. And we'll talk about that distinction later because that will now shift to the language I have on the screen. Also a QSIT element, and I'll tell you, if you haven't already been subject to this, CAPAs get investigated or inspected every time. Every time the FDA walks through the door, you're going to get a CAPA, some CAPA work that you have to do during the inspection. Product identification, packaging and labeling, handling, storage, distribution, installation. These record types we saw previously under design controls. They have a section called the design history file. The other two sort of big buckets of records that we have are in this section, DMR, device master record, DHR, device history record. Make note of those because those go away. But they're partly given other names, but there's a little bit of disconnect there that we'll talk about later as well. Complaints are also in the record section and how those complaints are handled and what the record should contain, as well as service and the use of statistical techniques wherever else in the quality system that might be appropriate. So what's happening to this? We have we've had that thing since 1997. It was finalized in 96. Since 1996, there have been no significant changes to the quality system regulation. So it's actually been even longer than the gap between the GMPs and the QSR. So 1996 to now 2024, and ultimately 2026, as we're going to see, we're going to go for about 30 years before we have, between the existing QSR and the implementation of the QMSR. In 2018, although there have been no changes, the FDA said, we want to re-examine the quality system regulation and realign that regulation with the current requirements of 13485. And also because we see this as a major alignment with regulatory authorities around the world that recognize that standard. Between 2018 and 2022, the FDA set, to my count, no less than 5 internal deadlines for when they were going to get the proposed rule revising the quality system regulation out for public comment. But in February of 2022, we finally did get it. They missed all those internal deadlines prior to that point. We all got sort of antsy about when this was actually going to appear in writing, and it did that in February. They published a proposed rule to amend not only Part 820, but also Part 4 for combination products to incorporate by reference ISO 1345-2016, and they renamed it at that time from the quality system regulation to the quality management system regulation, the QMS being a term that we see within the 1345 standard. And this idea of incorporating by reference was a little bit of a surprise to some of us because we fully expected, based on the way the FDA had previously talked about this new this revision of the regulation, that they would simply redline or revise the language in the QSR to realign with the new 1345 standard. And instead, they ditched almost all the content and just went straight with a incorporation by reference. On March 2nd, which literally just a week or so, a week and a half after they released the proposed rule, they convened a group that I didn't even know existed until it convened. But it hadn't convened in, I think, well over 10 years, which is the Device Good Manufacturing Practice Advisory Committee. It was an all-day meeting where the FDA walked through what they were doing in the regulation and provided opportunity for the public, including industry groups, to comment on in that public forum verbally what their thoughts were on the proposed rule. Now, they'd only had about a week and a half to look at it, but there were still plenty of comments around things like the transition period, document control requirements, and so on, and revisions of the 1345 standard that we were going to have to follow. In May of 2022, May 24th, the comment period closed. So it was open to public comment to that point. That closed. And then we waited almost 2 years for the FDA to issue the final rule. And that was issued on February 2nd. And that amended, again, 21 CFR Part 820 and Part 4. And we'll talk a little bit about Part 4 here in just a couple of minutes. February 2nd, 2026 is the date that the final rule will become effective. For those of you that read the proposed rule, and I'll revisit this in a second in case you're sleeping right now and you wake up later, the final rule becomes effective February 2nd. That's 2 years. If you remember in the proposed rule, the FDA proposed a 1-year transition period, which is what they provided for the QSR. During this DGMP Advisory Committee meeting in March of 2022, there were proposals from anywhere from the 1 year, yep, we like it, all the way to 2 and some to 4 years transition that they requested from the FDA. So we see here that the FDA did extend by 1 year what they had originally proposed as the transition period. We want to note here too that, and I'll mention this again shortly, that the FDA will not enforce the QMSR until February 2nd, 2026. On February 1st, 2026, you will still be complying with the current quality system regulation. And on February 2nd, you'll be complying with the quality management system regulation. And it's a hard switch. That's the effective date. But we are obligated to comply with the existing 21 CFR Part 820 up until that time. So 1345, as I mentioned earlier, was initially released in 1996, and it was an adaptation of the ISO 9001 standard specifically for medical device companies. And it primarily drives the establishment and the use of a quality management system for medical device manufacturing, and it's recognized around the world. In fact, in the European Union, it is one of the harmonized standards under the EU medical device regulation. So where the EU medical device regulation, the MDR, requires quality management system establishment and execution, they consider ISO 1345 to be the state-of-the-art standard that shows compliance to those expectations. Now, if you remember what we had in scope for the QSR, 1345 says that organizations, almost not by contrast, but elaborates a bit of a wider scope than we currently see, which is organizations that provide medical devices and related services, including design, development, production, storage, distribution, and so on. So a lot of the same things the FDA said, where it said, if you do these other things where they apply, you need to follow them. 1345, I think, makes it even just a little bit more clear that if you do these other activities related to a medical device, you're within the scope of 1345. And also, if you're someone that provides services to those companies, you could also be subject to the requirements of the standard, and that would include quality management system related services to these organizations. So if you're helping to establish or execute parts of a quality management system as a service to a medical device manufacturer, you will be held to the applicable requirements of the standard. Now, FDA from the very beginning has been very involved in the development and maintenance of the ISO 1345 standard. They were a key participant in 1996. They are continually involved through the ISO Technical Committee 210. ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, has actually, I think, now picked AMI, the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, as the sort of representative group to these technical committees. But the FDA actually participates through that organization in the ongoing work to keep 1345 moving. FDA also participates in the Medical Device Single Audit Program, the MDSAP program. For those of you not familiar with it, it's where an audit, a single audit, thus the name, from a notified body in one of the participating countries, and there are 5, would be recognized by the other countries in that group as if their own regulatory representatives, their own auditors, audited you as well. Each country has different levels of recognition for those audits. And in the FDA world, in the US, the FDA recognized MDSAP audits in lieu of their routine inspections. By the way, if you ever look at one of the FDA dashboards on inspections and look at the things that, the pie charts that they have and the graphs that they have around how many inspections have been done, how many are classified in different ways, what are the big areas that people are finding, you should note that that data does not include MDSAP data. So that's a big, so what I think we're going to see is those dashboards become, excuse me, those dashboards actually become a little bit less reflective of the actual state of the auditing data from the FDA as we go on, as time goes on and more people join the MDSAP program. And I bring up MDSAP because its basis is the 2016 revision of ISO 1345. So I think that's very interesting as well. FDA has said in the proposed rule, and they took this chart out of the final rule, we don't see it there, but if you go back to the proposed rule from February of 2022, the FDA notes all the sections in the current Part 820, the sections in 1345, and shows that with the exception of document control, labeling and packaging, records and servicing, the rest of the standard has a substantial equivalence or similarity to the existing regulatory requirements in the existing medical device regulations in the US. And so because of that substantial similarity, the FDA thought, well, we can do this without it being just this catastrophic trauma to the industry. And I will tell you that the timing of this is relevant as well, because in the 2016 revision of 1345, the Technical Committee 210 brought the ISO standard closer to the quality system regulation than it had ever been. and closed several of the gaps and even aligned some of the language in the ISO standard to be very, very similar to what we have currently in the QSR. So because of that, the timing of this action by the FDA seemed to be right for them. The FDA has the authority to make this change, as they stated in the preamble to the final rule, from Section 520 F1A in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which allows the Secretary, meaning the Secretary of Health and Human Services, to authorize the FDA to prescribe regulations in support of the act. And so, because of that, the FDA says they have the authority to make these changes. So the final rule itself is 101 pages. Most of that is preamble. Now, when I say 101 pages, it's actually about 30 if you look at the Federal Register version, where it was posted in the Federal Register, which has 2 columns and much smaller print. That's about 30 pages, I think. If you have the single, much easier to read, single column version, it's 101 pages. And the preamble, and by the way, in my view, even though technically the preamble is not the regulation is the regulation. The preamble, you should read the preamble. You haven't read the regulation, in my view, if you haven't included and read the preamble as well. The preamble provides a lot of the logic, as you can see here, for why the FDA feels they can do this, why they decided 1345 was the right thing to do, what the current framework is that allows the FDA to take this action, and how they built that around safety and effectiveness. And then more importantly, what incorporation by reference means, what they have included and excluded in incorporation by reference, meaning, and we're going to talk about what that means in a second. And then they took what was kind of astonishingly to me, less than 100 comments made to the proposed rule, broke it into 83 comment categories, and provided a response to each of those categories. And in those responses, this is the place where you're going to see why the FDA said what it said. They actually elaborate in some places almost like it was a guidance on the language that is much more succinct in Part 820 and even in the 1345 standard. And you get that elaboration, and I can guarantee you that in 43 observations in years to come, in deficiency letters, especially for PMA submissions where you have to include quality management system elements, you'll see copy and paste language out of the preamble in those documents. So it's of great value to you to not only read the preamble, but to incorporate the logic and the thinking that the FDA had in it and has reflected in it into your own quality management system remediation work. Sorry, I went a little too fast there. The last 2 parts of the final rule are the revised elements of 21 CFR Part 4, which I want to talk about in the next slide, and the now full text of the rewritten from the ground up 21 CFR Part 820, the QMSR. So let's go kind of line by line or section by section through each of these changes and see. I'll point out some things that are of interest to me that I thought might be of interest to you and might drive some of your thinking on what you do next with the final rule. 21 CFR Part 4 is the regulation for combination products. And this is for combination products where it's a drug and a device combination. Where the drug and the device are not sold as a single packaged entity, this part says for the drug constituent, follow the drug regulations. For the device constituent, follow the device regulations. Where these are packaged together, however, you need to decide, and the FDA will determine in its final word, whether you're more of a device than a drug. So you're a device with a drug constituent, or you're more of a drug than a device. They consider you a drug with a device constituent. If you're more of a device than a drug, then they will have the Center for Devices regulate you. And in that case, Part 4 says follow all of the medical device regulations and a subset, which they define for you, of the drug regulations. If the reverse is true and you're more of a drug than a device, you follow all the drug regulations in 21 CFR Parts 210 and 211, and they give you a subset of device regulations to follow. So what this change, this that we see in the final rule has done is it has taken those references to the medical device regulations and has, some of them will now refer to the QMSR, but most of them actually now point to relevant sections in 1345/2016. So because of that, if you're a combination product, especially if you're a drug with a device constituent, meaning you're really good at your drug regulations, CDER, the Center for Drugs, regulates you, you may now have some shifts that you have to do that you weren't expecting as a result of this medical device regulatory update. And that's really it for Part 4. That's all that changed in Part 4 with those references. Now let's look at Part 820 and some of the changes that occurred there. The scoping section of 820, 820.1, is largely identical to what it was in the quality system regulation. Finished devices, including HCTPs, are still in scope. Components and parts of finished devices are out of scope. Now, here's what I found interesting. And by the way, this is in the preamble, not in the regulation, which is why it's important to read these things. The FDA stated in the preamble, and I believe it was in response to comment 2, that they have the statutory authority to regulate component manufacturers, but will continue to exercise enforcement discretion and not regulate component manufacturers. But then they state that should they feel it's necessary to regulate component manufacturers in the future, if they think it's appropriate, they're going to do it. And then a component manufacturers will then be subject to the relevant parts of the regulation. The FDA goes on further to say, even though that's not a requirement to follow the QMSR on the part of component manufacturers, they strongly encourage you to do it anyway. And so I think what we might find, the way I see this playing out in inspection, I'm a finished medical device manufacturer, my purchasing controls are evaluating component manufacturers, but if that component manufacturer is not following the QMSR for the parts of the QMSR that are applicable, they might question the finished medical device manufacturer on why they picked that component manufacturer and how they're compensating for any gaps in the QMSR from the component manufacturer. So even though not a hard and fast requirement, that recommendation, similar to the recommendations we see in guidance, sometimes takes the look and feel of actual requirements, and we see that come out in inspection sometimes. This section also talks about how the QMSR or how we will address conflicts between the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and the QMSR, as well as where there may be conflicts between the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and the ISO standard. They give 2 examples of where this conflict might occur and does occur. For the definitions of device and labeling that are in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FDA has said that those definitions in the Act supersede those that are in the standard. And so the ISO standard definitions for medical device and for labeling are not the definitions we will use in the United States. We will instead use the definitions from the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and those have been transferred into the QMSR. The other example they give is that they recognize there is this idea of safety and performance in ISO 1345, and their view is that this is equivalent to the phrase safety and effectiveness in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So those are the big 3 things I saw in the scoping section that might be important. Definitions is where a lot of the action happens in the QMSR. There were a lot of terms that were changed, adopted differently. And so during the comment period, one of the big comments was that the definitions from 1345 weren't the only definitions that you had to follow if you wanted to truly align the US regulations with the standard. Because ISO 1345 only defines terms that are unique to that standard. All other terms that would be more general, it actually references ISO 9000, the 2015 revision, clause 3. And even though if you're following 1345 and the FDA incorporates that by reference, you would still have to follow this part of ISO 9000. It would be a two-step process to clarify that process did need to occur, and that's where you would go for a lot of these definitions. They added to their incorporation by reference not just ISO 1345 2016, but also incorporating by reference ISO 9000 2015 clause 3, just clause 3 of that standard. And what that resulted in is from the proposed rule, they now were able to delete definitions for customer, design validation, nonconformity, process validation, product. They changed the phrase management with executive responsibility from the QSR to the phrase top management that's in the ISO 9000 definitions, and also were able to eliminate verification. The one definitional change that really breaks my heart is that the word established is gone. For those of us who've been around a while, we've been battling with firms that don't understand this idea well enough for decades, 30 years by the time this all takes effect. The term established in the QSR is defined as meaning define, document, and implement. And that word implement is important because whenever people are told by the FDA they've not established a process, sometimes those companies will document the process and release it into their document control system and say that they've met the FDA requirement. But what they're not clear on is the fact that the term implement is also part of that definition. And so until you've provided evidence that you've executed those procedures, you've not yet established them. FDA has said in the preamble to the final rule here in QMSR land that they say that the word document in the ISO standard is equivalent to establish. Maybe. I'm a little skeptical that that's going to play out that way, especially as you have generations of FDA investigators that are not used to the word established, but only know the terms in the ISO standard. I think there may be a little bit of slippage in the requirement for implementation when we say that something must be documented. Now, the FDA maintains that the document requirement within ISO standard includes the maintenance and the execution of that of those procedures. I agree with that in principle, but I think the word established made it so clear, and I think we may have lost some of the clarity by losing that term. There were comments that said you should keep the term, and the FDA just said they didn't think it was necessary. As I implied earlier, DHF, DMR, DHR, gone. They don't exist anymore. And they have now been replaced, and although I say replaced by, it's not a one-for-one in any of these areas. It's a mostly overlapping, and so there may be a few gaps, but in principle, what the FDA says is that the design history file is the design and development file from the ISO standard. The device master record is the medical device file from the ISO standard. And medical device or batch records from the ISO standard are replacing what we know as the DHR, the device history record. Where this gets really kind of interesting from a structural point of view in the quality system is that if you remember in the current QSR, the definition in 820.3 of the current QSR defines design outputs. And that definition says that a finished design output constitutes the packaging, labeling, the medical device itself, and the device master record. So the device master record is a finished design output. And because it's a design output, that makes it part of the design history file. So the DMR, in effect, is a subset of the design history file. Well, that sort of embedding of the one file type into another file type is gone. The medical device file sits here, the design and development file sits here. There will be some overlap, surely, but that sort of one sitting within another concept is basically gone. And I'm sure you're aware, if you've been doing this for a while, the device history record is the place where each device you manufacture, or each batch of devices you manufacture, as the case may be, each get their own record of the manufacturing process at the end, so that you can always refer to that and show that they've been manufactured in accordance with the manufacturing instructions in the DMR, which shows that you could manufacture according to the specifications that were defined in the DHF. The term risk, that definition was pulled from ISO 14971 2019, but one thing that's interesting is in the ISO 1345 standard, they also say that risk includes compliance risk, where in 14971, it's really all about safety. For some reason, and I'm not a fan of this, although I can understand the logic behind it, the FDA decided not to incorporate by reference ISO 14971 2019. We're going to talk more about that and what we do about that and what that really means in one of the later slides of the presentation. But be aware, and the FDA in the preamble clearly said, they actually called out 14971 by name and said a lot of people wanted us to incorporate this by reference. And they gave a little bit of an explanation, but in my view, not a very satisfying one, basically saying, but we're not going to do it. So 14971 2019 is not incorporated by reference. We'll talk about what you do about that a little bit later. There are places, as I said before, manufacturer, labeling, and device, which supersede those that are in the standard. The words device and labeling come directly from the Act. The word manufacturer, QMSR defines and says that that definition supersedes that from the ISO standard. In section 820.7, which is where FDA elaborates its incorporation by reference, it starts by talking about the congressional authority that it has, that I sort of made bigger text for you earlier, saying that they have the authority to create the regulation, but the Freedom of Information Act also states, so outside of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act says the FDA can absolutely make regulations. The Freedom of Information Act says to reduce paperwork, which is a little bit of an interesting idea. I'm sure some of you are kind of laughing at that idea, actually. In order to reduce paperwork and material that has been published in the Federal Register, executive branches can incorporate by reference external documents. And when they do that, it will be as if that external document was also published in the Federal Register, giving it the force of law. The final rule, by the way, as we talked about earlier, removes almost all the content from the pre-existing 21 CFR Part 820 and replaces it with these three elements we've been discussing. The reference to 21 CFR 1340, reference to ISO 1345 2016. So not rewriting it as we thought might happen, but instead just simply referencing it in total and then tailoring it where they feel it's necessary. As we also talked about in the definition section 820.3, they are referencing, and this is a change from the proposed rule, referencing directly, incorporating by reference, clause 3 of ISO 9000 2015, which gives you that full glossary, that full quality management system glossary. And then there are clarifications and tailoring, additions and subtractions from those standards in the rest of the QMSR, where you incorporate them by reference, but not just saying here they are and running away, but there are some statutory authority limits. There are some definitional things within US law that had to be taken into consideration. And because of all of that, they couldn't just take the standards and make no changes to them whatsoever. They do have tailoring within the QMSR. The one One of the big barriers that the FDA always talked about when asked why they didn't just incorporate ISO 1345 by reference before now was that both ISO 1345 and now, because it's incorporated by reference, ISO 9000 are all copyrighted material. And the only way you can get to them is by purchasing copies of them from ISO or ANSI or some other location. I know a lot of people go to Estonia, of all places, because they have English versions of some of the standards, and they're not as expensive. So maybe that's just a little life hack that you can put off to the side in your notes if you're taking notes. Go look at Estonia; their standards are cheaper. But there, by U.S. law, all regulatory requirements for the U.S., all legal requirements in the U.S. have to be published and available to the public free of charge. And so the question was, how do you navigate that shift or that difference in the way that the standards are communicated and made available versus the U.S. regulatory requirements? The answer, and it's not a satisfying one, is that on the ANSI website, there is an incorporated by reference portal. And in that portal, and by the way, if somebody from Greenlight Guru is or somebody else who's in the chat, if you're running off to the side to Microsoft Explorer to find that portal and want to post the link in the chat, please do that. I'm sure everybody will find it valuable. But this incorporation by reference portal allows you to view the standard for free. Here's the catch: no copying so that you can paste it in other places, no printing, and no downloading. So you can view it, but you can only view it. Unless you want to illegally make screenshots of every single half page, page by page, you cannot download that material from that ANSI site. If you want the standard where you have access to it all the time, can mark it up or distribute it more widely in your own document control system or your own libraries, you're going to have to purchase it. And again, there's a wide variety of places you can purchase. So the FDA technically got away from this, but not so much. Now, here is an interesting plot twist to that problem. Recently, the EU just passed an act that all international standards that are required by the medical device regulation, I think it may be by all EU acts, must be made free of charge. They cannot charge for those. So that's going to be interesting. Now, and I say standards, it's standards that are localized or specific. They have to be made free of charge. Big global international standards like 1345, the rule's still out on how that will apply to them. But it's quite possible that because of the EU, we might actually have access. Now, it will be interesting to see if they make it free in the EU, but not free to others. But if they do that, and you have to comply with MDR, how do you still show that you get the free copy? I don't know how all that's going to work out yet, but it could be possible that as an outcome of that EU Act, not the AI Act, this EU Act, that we may be able to get free copies of 1345 and ISO 9000 in the future. We'll see. But for now, you got to go to the display only site or purchase it. Another big issue of contention was on how the FDA was going to handle future updates to the 1345 standard. Well, in fact, in the all-day meeting that they had, there was some debate over whether the FDA should just refer to 1345 and not the revision, so that as the standard was revised, we would automatically incorporate those sections, those revisions. FDA said, nope, we're not doing that. There are issues with making sure that we don't overstep our statutory authority, or where we think that something is important in the US that's not reflected well. We still want to have the ability to do that. So we're going to be specific to 2016. And they said clearly in the proposed rule and the final rule that if there are changes, those will not automatically become part of the QMSR. They will be evaluated by the FDA to see how they incorporate those revisions. And if they do, it'll go through this rulemaking process again. And keep in mind, we had 2018 to 2022 before we got a proposed rule, 2022 to 2024 before we got a final rule. Hopefully, if it's just revising the standard, it wouldn't take that long, but you're still talking about years if there are updates to 1345 before we might see those updates reflected in U.S. regulatory requirements. And what's a little kind of a gotcha here is that, if you recall, February 2nd, 2026 is the date that the QMSR becomes effective. Well, the next revision of 13485 could be as early, because they look every 5 years at their own at each standard to see if it needs revision. The next time that happens is 2026. So wouldn't it be a little tragic if we finally have alignment with the international standard in the 2016 revision, and the very year that becomes effective, the ISO standard changes, and there's a gap again? Now, I know the FDA is pushing the technical committee to state for 2026 that they will not make revisions, and they will reevaluate the next 5-year period, 2031. I don't know how successful that's going. If somebody knows more about has more of an inside track on how that conversation is going, please put it in the chat. But as far as I know, that's the FDA's position in the technical committee, but I don't know that it will be adopted. I don't know what's going to happen in these revision conversations that are happening right now. Section 820.10 is where the FDA reiterates some quality management system scoping and linkage concepts with the QMSR. So first of all, it says that, yes, we have a new regulation 820, but don't forget, if you're a medical device company, you still have to comply with 803, 806, 821 as applicable, and 830. So MDRs, medical device reports, corrections and removals, medical device tracking for those companies that are subject to that requirement, and UDI. There will have to be some changes to references, with guidances and things that go with those, but those regulations stay in place and in force. The FDA also clarified that the device classifications that are subject to the design and development requirements are the same as they were under the existing, or they are under the existing quality system regulation. So where ISO 1345 says all medical devices are within scope, the FDA reiterates that class 2, class 3, and some class 1s, and they specify what those conditions are subject to the QSR. But the conversations I've seen on LinkedIn and other places are that they feel the FDA is not truly complying with 1345 because 1345 says it applies to all medical devices, and the FDA is basically saying no, only these classes. But the standard goes on to say the local regulatory requirements for the competent authority in that geography prevail. And so in this case, the FDA has made that call. It is consistent with what 1345 allows. And so it will be the same scope as it was before. This section also extends these requirements of the standard to implantable devices and devices that support or sustain life. And they, as we stated before, reiterate that if you don't comply with the QMSR, that your device is adulterated by virtue of how that term is defined in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and elsewhere. 820.35 is where we talk about control of records. And so it's just this slide and one more on content, and then we're going to drill down to a couple of concepts and wrap up. But 820.35 is the control of records. And here was where one of the big areas of concern from the proposed rule came up, and the FDA kind of caved to the comments, and I think rightly so. In the proposed rule, there was a statement that you must obtain the signature for each individual who approved or reapproved the record, so for all records, and the date of such approval on that record, and include the below information in certain records. And the below information was for complaints and things. The implication that the way the industry read that was, wait a minute, there are things the quality system regulation did not require us to approve and release through the document control system that this statement seems to imply will make us do exactly that. And the big concern was things like complaint records. Complaint records definitely need to be controlled, but they are not part of the document control process where they have to be signed off and approved and released and change controlled through document control. So industry complained about that. They commented on that. The FDA said, you know what? That probably was a bridge too far. We're going to pull that statement out and instead just lean on the approval requirements that are stated explicitly in the ISO standard. So that's gone, that sort of universal signature requirement, and it now just leans on how 1345 does it. This section also has specific content requirements for complaint records and service records, and talks about some complaint requirements and adds complaint requirements that we didn't see in the proposed rule. So the first one is where they clearly define when a complaint investigation must be initiated. And they say, and I put the quote here, if it involves the possible failure of a device, labeling, or packaging to meet any of its specifications, then that allegation will then become a complaint, and it will have to be investigated under the complaint parts of the standard. The FDA then goes on to say, and this is stuff that we did not see, we don't have the current quality system regulation either, that if you're a large organization, you manage multiple complaint handling units, the FDA expects your procedures are harmonized and consistent across all of those complaint handling units. And they've gone a step further and even said that you should also designate a single unit or group that will ultimately be responsible for coordinating all those functions, and I guess by extension, harmonizing those processes. And I'm sure the FDA will want to know what that group is. And that's the group they will go to if they look at multiple sites of your company. They will go to them and hold them accountable for inconsistencies they see across the complaint handling units in the way they act. Then there's this issue of corrective and preventive actions, or CAPA. Now, as I said, if you look at the current 820.100, the language there in 820.100 is corrective and preventive actions. And the way the old school people would kind of consider this, and we still see it in a lot of complaint record or CAPA records today, is that I have a corrective action that addresses the nonconformance, and then I also within that record have a preventive action that makes sure it doesn't happen again, that prevents its recurrence. That's not the way the ISO standard does it. They have a separate section for corrective actions and preventive actions, two separate sections. And the idea of corrective actions includes preventing recurrence of the nonconformance. So about 99% of everything you're doing from now on would be just corrective actions. Preventive actions, on the other hand, are strictly preventing the potential occurrence of a nonconformance. And we might almost consider those to be process improvements in many cases. So that's a bit of a shift. And although if you're doing it a different way now, it won't get you in trouble, I don't think. But it's probably a good time to shift your thinking that if I'm doing a corrective action, that some of those actions are because they should be addressing the root cause that you identified in the investigation, they should be preventing the recurrence, because the definition of a root cause is it is an item that, if eliminated, would prevent the occurrence of the nonconformity. So if your corrective actions are addressing your root causes, then almost by definition, they are preventing recurrence of that nonconformity. And that's how the ISO standard treats it. The FDA also added this term corrections to the CAPA vocabulary, which we've always had in CAPA. We talk about containments, corrections, corrective actions, and preventive actions. The term corrections is now that vocabulary term that we all know from CAPA land and have for some time is now officially incorporated into the regulatory requirements, although they really focus on it in this section as it relates to complaints, saying that your complaint, the way you handle complaints, should correct the nonconformance that the complaint may indicate. The last section we want to talk about as a specific section is 820.45. This is device labeling and packaging controls. It's the one area where the FDA thinks that ISO just blew it, that they don't have it correct. And what they've done instead is sort of create their own packaging, labeling and packaging control section of the regulation. And where they specifically think it's a problem in the ISO standard is around inspections. They don't believe that the requirement in the ISO standard for inspecting labels is sufficient. And they call out a specific example, I believe it's in the preamble, where they have had recalls that have come from medical device manufacturers where they had a device, an automated device, that read the labels and supposedly marked out or pulled from or did not allow to be applied labels that were somehow incorrect. But those automated systems are still prone to error, and some of those errors have driven recalls. And so the FDA says, fine if you're using those systems, but we still expect that for you to take a statistically significant sample of those labels, even if they are inspected using an automated tool, and reviewing them with a human prior to release of the product. And so the FDA comes down much harder on the inspection of labels in this section than the standard does, and they actually feel that that's a deficiency in the standard that they want to compensate for in the regulation. Now, as I talked about before, let's talk briefly about risk management. The FDA, as we showed before, does not incorporate ISO 14971-2019 by reference. And by extension, there's also the ISO TIR or TR 24971-2020, which is the guidance that should always accompany that 14971 standard. So those two documents are no longer, they're not required by either the 1345 standard explicitly, although there's connection points there, or now by the FDA. And the FDA in the preamble explicitly said, we're not going to incorporate that standard. I understand the logic again. I think I get why they said those things. But I consider it, I advise against taking advantage of that loophole, if you want to call it one. And here's why. First of all, the treatment of risk across the full product life cycle was one of the key motivators for FDA choosing to align the US regulations with the ISO standard. ISO 1345 talks about risk throughout. As we showed before, or talked about before, the QSR does not. It's embedded, buried almost, in the design validation section of design controls. FDA said, we've always wanted risk management to be full life cycle, but the regulations were not clear on it. 1345 this is a primary motivator for us to adopt the standard. And we know that ISO 1345, although it doesn't mandate compliance, pulls some items from 14971 and references it. Second reason why I think we should not take advantage of this loophole. The FDA recognizes and has, I think since 2007, has recognized as a recognized consensus standard ISO 14971. And the 2019 revision is the current recognized consensus standard on the FDA website. Now, the FDA when it lists documents on that site, does not require conformance to that standard, to any standard on that site. But they clearly state that if you follow that standard, the FDA will consider that to be adequate for demonstrating compliance with its regulatory requirements in that particular quality system or product area. So the FDA would view compliance with 14971-2019 as meeting its expectations for compliance with risk management principles broadly across the medical device industry. And in fact, Etienne and I were talking about this in the kind of the backstage area before we got on the call. The pharmaceutical industry, which follows ICH-Q9 for risk management, in my view, and I won't refer to it in as derogatory terms as I did to Etienne, but I will say that they are a bit shortchanged in the pharmaceutical industry by having ICH-Q9 versus what we're privileged to have in the medical device industry under ISO 14971. Now, keep in mind that in Part 4, 21 CFR Part 4, the combination products regulation, we talked about that a bit ago. That, remember, I said if you're a drug with a device constituent, then you must follow certain elements of the medical device regulations, and you follow all the elements of the drugs. One of the elements you always had to follow for the device constituent was design controls, which means that one little statement about risk analysis in design controls under design validation would apply to you as a drug company for at least the device constituent. And in those cases, I always tell people in those companies or in those situations, in fact, I was on the phone with a client just yesterday. It's a pharmaceutical client, and we were talking about risk management and FMEAs. And I told them, there's no reason for you to do this other than because I told you it's better. But ISO 14971 is better than ICH-Q9, and you should follow it to the greatest degree possible. Line it up with your risk management process and just follow it because it's well structured. It provides a clear way of walking through, standardized way of walking through risk management, and through it and its 24971 guidance gives specific examples, specific example tables of things like probability, breaking out probability by P1 and P2, probability that hazardous situation occurs, P1, probability that if it occurs, it will cause harm, P2, combining that over and then comparing that to severity to come up with a risk rating. The way it talks about data security and incorporates that, all those things are in the standard. It's well structured. ICH-Q9 has the same basic structure, but kind of stops with each paragraph. And sometimes it's only a paragraph where it'll be a whole section in 14971 and a larger section in 24971. And that paragraph sometimes doesn't get much beyond yes, have some. So because of those reasons, I strongly recommend that even though it is not required or incorporated by reference in the QMSR, while you're in the kitchen, while you're remediating your quality system to comply with the new regulation, you're bringing in 1345, you're bringing in clause 3 of ISO 9000 2015. Bring this in as well. If you're not already complying with it, do so. Not because the FDA told you to, but because it's the right thing to do. And frankly, if you're not following it, even though it's not required or incorporated by reference, you're quite likely to have a very difficult conversation with the FDA in showing how your system is better. Because again, they do recognize it as a consensus standard. And so if you're not following it, good luck trying to show how what you're doing is better. So just do it. Now's the time if you're not already doing it. A couple more slides and we're done. Well, three more, this one and two after. During the transition, as I said before, February 2nd, 2026, this doubles the transition period the FDA proposed in the proposed rule. It was a year there. The FDA said, well, we think people need more time. We acknowledge the comments that were made along these lines. We're going to go with 2026. I was in the 1 year camp. I think 1 year was probably sufficient, but it's 2 years. I get it. And frankly, because of all the changes the FDA is going to have to make, and we're going to talk about some of those in a second, and the training they have to make, and a reorg they have coming up, I think more than, even though they say we think industry needs more time, I think FDA needs more time. And they're going to make good use of this 2 years to sort of update things and release things that are necessary for them to support the QMSR. Couple of points of ambiguity, and I'm sure if you think about it in your company, you can think of more. But here's a couple that pop to the top of my list. For FDA inspections between now and the 2nd of February 2026, even though the FDA has clearly stated they will only hold us accountable to following the current QSR, will we get some feedback on potential violations of the QMSR? If not in the 483s, and we don't want them there because it's not an observation of noncompliance, at least in the discussion items or in offline discussions or in some other format. This will help, in my view, if they would do this. It helps the FDA investigators get ready to start looking for those things before they have to, and they get that in that habit. And secondly, it helps industry better understand the expectations FDA has of them as we lead up to that February 2nd time. And I think it just benefits both sides if we can get some feedback. I don't know if the FDA will. They've been very kind of closed-mouthed about how they're going to handle inspections. My contacts in the FDA have. We'll see how this goes. The second one, and it's a very specific circumstance, but PMA submissions require that you incorporate or include a description of your quality system. So for PMA submissions that are submitted prior to February 2nd, 2026, so still QSR required, but they are not subject to the final decision from FDA until after February 2nd, 2026. How will those be treated? How will the FDA address what information they expect to get from the manufacturer in that submission? Which QMS requirements will the FDA be reviewing? Will they be reviewing QSR, but then tell you, but keep in mind that if you have an inspection after we decide, it's going to be a QMSR inspection? Or will they say, because you won't be distributing this until after that date, we're going to be looking for QMSR requirements, even though technically you don't have to have them in place yet? I don't know. It'd be a good thing to clarify. I would expect you, especially if you're a company that's a good planner and you get ahead of the game and you're trying to get these things in your current quality system and the new requirements harmonized early rather than late to give your organization time to adapt to them, you're going to have a short-term regulatory burden that's going to be a little higher because you will have to show compliance to the QSR, and they're not going to accept QMSR as a replacement until February 2nd, 2026. But because you're planning well and you want your people to be able to instantly start to execute on that date, you're going to update your QMS in advance of that. You will have to sort of show that you're doing both for some period of time. So just a thought. Now, if you're following MDSAP or you're already certified, we'll talk about that in a minute. You're in better shape, but still something to think about. Things to think about during inspections. First of all, the FDA is making clear that because they're adopting the QMSR and incorporating by reference an international standard that notified bodies audit to, do not expect that to change the FDA's inspectional authority. It's the same as it always was. If you're in MDSAP, they will accept those audits in lieu of a routine inspection. But other than that, the FDA will inspect your site, as they always have. Secondly, they are going to replace QSIT, the quality system inspection technique that they use as a guideline for how they inspect and what they look for when they inspect medical device manufacturers. They said in the preamble that they're not going to provide details on what that will include or when it will happen, and they feel that the rulemaking process by which the proposed rule and the final rule were published is the wrong forum to provide those details. So they basically said, stay tuned, we'll tell you something later. Here's the one that a lot of people get hung up on. Actually, all of them on here can be items that are of concern to you depending on your situation. The FDA is not turning into a notified body. They are not going to issue 1345, and I have a typo there, sorry, 1345 2016 certificates as an outcome of their inspections. They are aligning the regulatory requirements in the US with those of the international standard, but they are not turning into a notified body. They are a competent regulatory authority. They will act as such, and you will have to seek certification through your notified body scheme. Conversely, if you have a certification for 13485, the FDA will not exempt you from their own inspections. Just because you got audited by a notified body to that standard, unless you're on the MDSAP program and it's a routine inspection, the FDA will still come and inspect you. So yes, you might get inspected to the same basic things from two different bodies that, because there is variation between human beings, may look at different things and focus on different things. You're going to get this sort of maybe inconsistent inspection and audit on the same basic material between the two bodies. That's going to happen. So just be ready for it, but do not expect that because you're certified. Don't go to the FDA and say, why are you here? A notified body's already inspected me to 13485. The FDA doesn't care. That's not what they're there for. MDSAP will continue to do what it does. It will exempt the firm from FDA inspections that are routine, and the impact to what will change them because of MDSAP or because of the 1345 adoption in the US is not yet clear. My guess is a lot of those places in the MDSAP audit policy that were very specific to US requirements are probably going to get stripped out because those peculiarities won't exist anymore because we're more aligned with the standard. Here's the big one for a lot of people, although it really shouldn't be if you're already certified. Under the current QSR and in a footnote in the QSIT guide, the FDA says we will not review management review minutes, internal audit reports, or supplier audit reports when we inspect you. That is, they had all along the statutory authority to do that, but by their own action in the regulation, they stripped themselves of that authority by policy and have not reviewed those documents. That restriction is gone. They will now review management review, internal audits, and supplier audits starting February 2nd, 2026. Now, if you've ever had a notified body in your house, they were doing that anyway. And that's one of the big reasons why the FDA said they're doing it, is why can everybody else do it and we can't? So they're going to be doing that starting in 2026. Last slide. Just some final thoughts on what I think the impacts are to both the industry and the agency. To the industry, if you already have a 1345 certification, I think the changes that you're going to have to make will be non-zero. So don't think, oh, I'm done. I'm already 1345 certified. Nothing for me to do. Wrong. There are changes in the QMSR to the requirements of the standard that you need to adopt. So do that. If nothing else, you have reference changes to make. But you'll have a lighter burden, but a non-zero burden. If, however, especially if you're a U.S. company that's only ever sold in the U.S., or a country that does not need 1345 certification, you're not certified, this is going to be a bigger deal for you. And you should allow yourself plenty of time and likely get some outside expertise to help you make this move. The FDA, their impact, they got to update QSIT. How are they going to inspect us? They have training they have to do in the field. They got a reorg coming, and we're not sure how that's going to impact this. And for any of you that have done process improvements in your lives for companies ever, you think your process, once it's released, because it's gone through so many reviews, so many iterations, so many revisions, it's perfect. It's going to work great. There's no problem. Everybody's had their say on it. It's going to execute fine. And then literally within the first week it's out in the field and people are starting to use it, there's issues. And you realize that you didn't think of things, there's gaps here, people misunderstand things, you didn't think it was open for interpretation, but people are interpreting it differently, all kinds of things, and you struggle with those, getting those gaps and those issues resolved over time. This is going to be no different. The FDA thinks it's good. I think it's probably pretty good as well, but once people start using it, who knows what's going to pop up? And I would say there could even be challenges based on their current statutory authority. I don't know what those will be, but again, until it happens, until it's rolled out, you just never know. So with that, I'm done. Please feel free. I know there's a Q&A section here. I'm going to flip over to that little tab as well on my screen. Etienne, I'll let you kind of take it and walk us through some of the questions, but I appreciate everyone's time calling into this. Very much appreciate what you spent getting this information in terms of the value of your own time. And I hope it was worth it for you.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. Really appreciate it. I know you talked for a long time with your sore throat, so appreciate that.
No problem.
I'll go ahead and share one. I think you already answered this, but maybe it's worth. It's the highest voted question. Maria asked if we're already under ISO 13485, do we need to make any reference changes inside our documents as FDA regulation?
Yes, I think you do. I think that's going to be, again, even if you're certified at 1345, it's likely because you've been living in two worlds. You've had the audits for 1345, you've had the QSR you've had to deal with. So your quality manual and other documents, they've likely pointed to both. So what you can do is, except for those areas where the FDA has stripped out the 1345 requirements and made some particular changes to them, you're going to just refer to 1345. Now, I think what's going to happen in the end is you're still going to have to refer to both because there is that tailoring in 820 still. But the impact of those references will be quite different. And so, for instance, if you're in design controls, you're not going to refer to 820.30 anymore. You're going to refer to like 7.3 or 7.4 within 1345.
Okay, great answer. Debbie asked, we're already compliant with ISO 1345. Where can I find the differences between 1345 and the new QMSR? And I know FDA intentionally did not give that comparison, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, I can almost bet you that there's about 100,000 of those things if I Googled it right now, where people have done those comparisons because they were doing them QSR versus 1345 a long time, for a long time ago. I think even Greenlight Guru probably has published something that compares the existing QSR and 1345. Yep. So to be kind to my hosts, I will say Greenlight Guru will probably have one of these for you before too long. But in the meantime, I don't have one personally, but I'm going to go out and get one here pretty soon as I start working with my clients. But there are tools out there, I'm sure, that are already out there that will compare the existing QSR, the QMSR, and 1345, kind of as a tripartite comparison table. I think it's going to be very valuable. And if you can't find one, you're going to have to make one because it's going to be important to your remediation efforts.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to be non-partisan here because we do have one, and feel free to reach out to the email. We'll send you what we have. I always recommend spot checking it. I mean, because you have to defend whatever you publish in your QMS. So,
right.
All right. Carolyn asked, I understand that the rule, you already covered this, but the hard switch of complying with QSR and QMSR had a lot of votes, so I thought I would just go ahead and let you reiterate that or your comments on that.
Yeah, Carolyn, I got bad news for you. Yes, it's a hard switch. But I will say the FDA in the preamble, they say that they fully expect companies to start complying with the QMSR early. But don't let that mislead you into wholly adopting QMSR, abandoning your QSR compliance, and getting in trouble in an inspection because you move too fast or you don't maintain that. I mean, heck, you've been maintaining double standards for years doing 1345 and QSR. This is going to be a triple standard where you're going to have to keep QSR compliance, update, but make some of those updates effective maybe February 2nd, 2026, or adopt them early, but find a way to defend the actions in both circumstances for a short time.
Yeah. Okay. Great answer. Dorothy asked a different question. Could you still use terminology from QSR in internal documents? And maybe we'll look at this as after the implementation deadline. Do you think all of those terminology, all the terminology that we're used to is going to go away? DHF, DR, so on.
Yeah, the terminology will go away, and it all gets replaced by 1345 and ISO 9000's clause 3. However, what I can tell you is that at least as far as the FDA is concerned, and notified bodies are pretty forgiving here as well. Companies all over the place have their own vocabulary, And often that vocabulary comes into conflict with what's in the regulatory documents or the standards. As long as you can explain how what you do is equivalent to what the regulatory term is, then you're going to be fine. So obviously, we always advocate for people we speak with to use as much of the vocabulary that your regulators are using as you can, because it keeps conversations down to a minimal level where they're trying to understand what you're doing, because they don't get it. It's not what the vocabulary they use. You want to reduce that as much as possible, but especially for those of you that have had this QSR vocabulary for centuries in your organizations. Everybody knows how to do it. Everybody knows what the term is. Create a map. Create a map in your own glossary to the new term and say, when we say this, it means that. Provide that to an auditor, an investigator, and I think you'll be fine.
Really practical advice. I appreciate that. Sarah asked, because I'm skipping down. Apologies to those who voted here, but I'm skipping down because I'm curious. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the independent reviewer. It's always been a QSR specific requirement for design reviews. Seems to be established good practice for medical device design and development. What's your recommendation?
That's a good question. I am doing a quick. There it is. So, if you look in the preamble under comment 46 to the final rule, the FDA says that FDA considers clause 7.3.5 of 1345 to provide adequate flexibility for organizations to balance management of personnel and other resources in the organization with the important contribution of independent review to the design and development process. Manufacturers may choose which individuals to include in each stage of design review to comply with requirements. So this is talking about design review, how it required an independent reviewer. It was very specific on what they meant by independent reviewer. That is not quite as clear in ISO 1345. So there's more flexibility on who that may be for you, but the FDA says they know that that function is still important.
Okay. Fantastic. One more question. We'll make this the last question. Let's see here. Trying to think of a good one. That's how will let's go with Zebas, if I got your name correctly. How will the change impact other programs such as MDSAP, if at all?
Yeah, so it's a very unsatisfying answer I have for you. We don't know. The FDA has been clear that there will be changes to MDSAP. They don't know what theirs are going to be yet. They've got a couple of years to really finalize those. I will tell you that I've seen the MDSAP documents turn over much faster than other regulatory documents and standards. So once the MDSAP committee says, here's how we want to make this adaptation to the new requirements in the United States, they'll do it. And they'll do it fairly short order. But I don't have specifics for you. I know a couple of the people that are working with MDSAP from the FDA, but they're very closed-mouthed about it. And I think the tone of voice, the body language tells me that the reason that we're not getting a lot of feedback is because they just don't know yet. They're still kind of in the analysis phase of those changes.
Okay. No, I appreciate it. I'm going to ask the audience one question, and I asked this at the beginning, but if there's a topic you would like us to cover in the future, put that in the chat. We have only 3 minutes left or so, but I'm going to go ahead and give Eric's voice a break. He's been talking for a long time, and I really appreciate all of the effort you put into this. It was a very informative presentation, a lot of good insights. So really appreciate that. Quick reminder to those of you who are, who you may be wondering this, will you be sending today's recording and presentation slides? We always get those questions at the end. Yes, those will be coming in an email. So look out for that. And send us our feedback. What did we do well? What would you like to change? I know Eric's always striving for improvement as well. We'd love any kind of feedback you have. We'll let you all get back to the rest of your day. But on behalf of Greenlight Guru, thank you all for attending today's presentation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Eric.